Hello and welcome to my Halloween special. So today we're going to make your own Halloween pumpkin LED decor stained glass style. Now what I started off was number one, to buy or form your own wire framed pumpkin. Now you can get these at many places. Amazon has them, Walmart has them, many different places has them. They're all a little different, but they're all about the same. Now, first of all, because I'm going to want to solder to my wire frame, I wrap the whole wire frame in copper foil. So I'm using 7/32 inch copper foil. Most of the time when I'm wrapping wire, I use kind of inexpensive copper backed foil, because I don't really need the special black backed foil for this, because I'm not going to see through it, so I'm not really worried about what the back looks like. So that's usually what I use. If you run out of this, or if all you have is a different color, you can just use a different color, that's fine. Using 16 gauge wire, I now cut little pieces. I made a spider web decor over it, and I'm using little 16 gauge pieces of wire at a slight arc and soldering them around so like they look like cobweb, the lines, you know, like in a cobweb, a spider cobweb, because that's what I want to decorate this with. Now I don't know if I would do this like this again. It's kind of a pain to do each one individually, because they're so little and small. When you heat one side of the wire, sometimes the other side will heat up so much it'll just fall off. So it's kind of time consuming. It might be more successful to just bend it into concentric circles that have that cobwebby little arch in each section. I don't know, but this way I cut each one, and if they were a little bit too long, I used wire cutters and snipped them off. So yeah, this kind of took a while, and I just did one area at the beginning, and later on I filled in the other area. So I'm using my 4060 solder, and yes, I haven't gotten my new tip for my solder iron. They keep on telling me that it's delayed in shipment, so I guess it's going to show up tomorrow, because my tip is just kind of falling apart and getting very, very old. So bear with me, it still works. So I solder one side on, and then sometimes I have to bend the wire a little bit more to get the right shape and the right size. Right now I'm trying to go over one of those little arches that are in the original wire frame of the pumpkin. So I'm going to solder it to that thicker wire there that came with the wire frame, and then I'm going to solder it to the wire that I put for my cobweb. So I'm just trying to get it in place. I'd like to use different needle nose pliers for this. You'll notice my pliers look a little on the rusted side. That's because once you get flux and water on your pliers, after a while, yeah, they do rust. You can use a rust cleaner, which you kind of dunk your tools in, and they do kind of revive, but they're never quite the same as they were when they were brand new, but at least they're usable. So this is my partially done cobweb after I rinsed it in soap and water. And I like the little globs of solder at the connections. I think that looks good. Now I'm going to foil mosaic tiles. These are the kind of tiles that you would use for doing, usually for dry mosaic and cement type work. You can get them in squares and rectangles and triangles and diamonds, all different colors. They're usually around 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, so they're pretty small. Often I use a whole piece of my 7/32 inch foil, black backed foil, to foil these when I'm doing other works. But for this one, I wanted to have, these are for the teeth of my pumpkin, and I didn't want to cover too much of the glass itself. So I cut my foil in half so they just barely overlap the top and bottom of the glass. And right now I'm just kind of burnishing it down so it's nice and strong. And I have different colors of ambers that I'm going to be using in the teeth later on, so you'll see that. And you can see a little bit of the smile on the upper right hand side. And right now I put the smile in place, which was a wire shaped smile, and I attached some, I attached all the teeth to it. So there's some clear teeth and some yellow and some orange. And now I'm adding more of my cobweb lines. And yeah, I did have some difficulty sometimes trying to get them to attach one of them without making the other one fall off. So that was, you know, kind of a challenge. Whoops, there he goes. And trying to hold them in place while I'm soldering. So that's why I said maybe it would be better to make them as like, you know, cobwebby shaped circles and then attach them. But then you'd have to, like, I don't know, draw it out on paper first so you make sure that you have the little bends in the right places. So that's just a different look that one could get. You could start off with a long piece of wire like this one and then, you know, attach one side and then cut it and then attach the other side. So that's, you know, one way of doing it. Now, when I'm done with this project, I want to use black patina because, hey, it's Halloween. I want that black look. So I'm going to have to cover each piece of copper with solder, because if you don't cover them with solder or start off with tinned wire to begin with, the copper patina will not stick. So yeah, I could have chosen to use tinned wire to begin with now, or I have never used the silver coated, silver colored foil. I don't know if that takes patina. I'm going to try that soon. Now I'm going to foil and then I'm going to wrap what I'm using for the eyes. So these are large globs of glass. You can buy globs of glass in different sizes. Sometimes they call them globs, sometimes they call them flat marbles, but you can get them at many different places in different colors. And this is an opaque black one. I actually used these in a lamp I did earlier, and I had a couple left over, so I'm using them in this. So I just wanted two for the eyeballs, and those two white things on the left of it, those are silicone wrapped thumbtacks. And what those are actually push pins. And what those are is I just stuck them into my board that I'm using, and I'm like using that as something to push against to help with my soldering. So that's what they're there for. So I did one of the eyeballs, and now I'm doing another. So I wrapped these pieces of glass in a piece of foil. Now the foil was only like a third of the width of a 7/32 inch foil, so it's pretty thin. So I'm just wrapping around the thickest diameter of the eyeball of the black glob, and now I'm wrapping a piece of 16 gauge bare copper wire around it to help hold it in place, because obviously that just putting a foil piece of copper foil around it isn't really going to be very sturdy. So I can't really just solder these eyes on with just the copper foil holding them together. So I have this wire wrapped around it, which will just help hold it all together for my project. So I'm also back soldering it all so that it's really staying on as thoroughly as possible. Now, whenever you do something like this, especially if you're using a very thin piece of foil, don't heat up the foil a lot when you're soldering, because it will kind of make the sticky part, it'll kind of make it release. So it will unstick. So that's not what you want. You want to keep it attached, because yeah, some of the solder did wrap around a little bit, but a lot of the sticking power is with the adhesive that was on the foil. So watch out with that. Now I am tacking this in place while I was holding it. Now I could have worn my silicone gloves. That would have helped me a little bit in not getting it too hot to my fingers. But since I just was holding it with the glass just for a second while I was tacking it in place, I was fine. I am now soldering the wire that I put around the eyeball to the spider web. So as you can see, I'm soldering all the way around. I'm making it as soldered on as I can. It's not very secure, but you know, this is a decoration. I don't plan on pulling on these eyes or anything. Once this is hung on the wall, and hopefully it's not going to be dealt with. Now this eyeball is actually kind of more tricky because it doesn't have the cobweb to help hold it in place. So it only is going to be wrapped around this one wire that came with the original form. So what I did was I left the wires a little bit longer on this one, and I'm using them to wrap around that wire that you can see, and that'll help hold it together is the thought there. Now what I have underneath it is just an old piece of cloth from a pillowcase or something. So I have something to hold on to it so that I don't get burned. And it's kind of like for extra support. So I'm soldering it on the best I can. I'm adding as much solder as I think it'll take. And to put extra support, I am adding a loop of copper wire in the back. Now remember, these eyes are opaque, so no one's actually going to be able to see through these. So if these were translucent eyes, I would not want to add a weird wire behind it, because then you'd see this weird wire. But because they're opaque, it's okay to have a loop in the middle there, and that should help support the eye, because as I told you before, it's just kind of sticking out there. There's nothing on the other side to hold it. So this is just a little bit extra support, which I think is very needed in this situation. Those glass globs, especially the big ones like this, which is like over an inch diameter, it's like an inch and a third diameter, they're pretty heavy. So you know, just having a little attachment from that one point of attachment is not all that secure. So that's why I decided I would beef it up a little bit, give it a little bit more hope of staying in place. So I'm soldering this in place the best I can all the way around. I'm not worried too much about having the whole thing tinned necessarily. Okay, now we're going to cut and foil the opaque glass, and then we're going to solder in place and add a perimeter wire for support. So this is the opaque glass that I bought to put in the background. And so I'm laying my pumpkin on the glass, and I'm going to draw out what I want, and then I'm going to cut this using my ring saw. Now, of course, you could use your regular hand cutting device for cutting the glass. It's just handy to have a ring saw, and I'm just very happy that I have one. I'm not as good about cutting like interior curves, and having a ring saw makes it so that I'm not wasting the glass. Now, if I was making this big curve by doing it by hand, I would probably want to make smaller straight cuts that people have explained how to do, and then I wouldn't have the other half of it for the other half of my pumpkin. And basically I'm using 2 pieces of 12-inch by 12-inch glass for this, and I would have had to use a lot more if I had cut this by hand. But I mean, there's that option if that's what you have. Now, the reason I used opaque glass is this is just going to be against my house, I envisioned, so I don't want it transparent. So now I have one piece, and then I laid it down, and then I drew the next piece so I could get the curve for the next piece. And yes, I could have made a pattern and drawn it all out at once and cut the pieces with paper, and then, you know, transferred the paper to my pieces of glass. But basically what I did here was I just did one at a time and built it up that way. So it's really whatever way you want to do it. I tend to kind of start at one point with an idea and then just kind of branch off from that instead of having the whole thing perfectly laid out ahead of time, and let my projects kind of evolve as I go. But you know, it's whatever you want. So these pieces of glass are on a foam board with some push pins holding it down in place while I am doing the soldering. And I did have them numbered so that I would remember what order they're going to go in when I cut them out. But that's, you know, that's fine. You can do that. And if you use a Sharpie marker, or, you know, whatever marker you have, there's lots of ways you can get the marker to come off the glass. So that's really not a problem. I kind of ran out of big pieces to use. So the middle of my pumpkin is just kind of the scraps that I had left over from cutting the other pieces. And I'm not going to worry about it. It's either that or go back to the store and get more glass. But for this design, you know, I'm not gonna let that bother me. I think the middle piece having some lines in it is just going to be part of the design, and I am fine with that. When I did piece together this, notice I tried to keep the grain of all the glass going up and down. So I didn't have some going sideways and some going up and down. I wanted them to kind of go like a pumpkin, you know, going with the grain of the actual curve of the pumpkin. Now I'm going to be using some more wire. I would use 16 or 18 gauge wire for this, or I guess you could go to 14 if you wanted to. I wouldn't go any thinner than 18. What I'm doing is I'm wrapping around the outside of my glass just to give it some extra support to solder to when I put it all together. You don't need to do this. I often do this when I'm doing pieces just because I'm always concerned that it's going to start falling apart, and I want to make sure the seams are all really strong, especially where 2 pieces might come together. It's pretty easy to do this. You just wrap your solder around it, and then where 2 pieces meet, like right up there on the left hand side, I can fill that gap in with solder and it'll all look fine. So now I am going around trying to make sure that it is where I want it. I'm using some little clips, as you can see down at the bottom there, and I'm using those to help hold it in place. So I want to go all the way around it and make sure that it's clipped together. Because this pumpkin, the original form, is just a wire form, it is kind of bendable, so you can kind of adjust it as you go. It's not really stiff, so I can kind of like just move it where I want it a little bit and clip it in place. And then I'm going to solder the two pieces together. So I'm going to solder my original form that I had bought, that I had wrapped in foil, and I'm going to solder that onto the glass, the opaque glass that I have just cut and put together. And while I'm doing this, I will also be adding some solder to the actual ribs of the pumpkin that I foiled earlier, because remember, I need to have everything covered with solder before I'm done, because I want to have it black when I'm done. So I'm adding solder everywhere. So I'm adding it to those little ribs, and that's a great thing to do. And I'm adding it all the way around to make sure it's all connected. I'm using a gel flux. I always use a gel flux, or usually use a gel flux, because it's not very liquidy. You can paint it on kind of with a paintbrush, and it pretty much stays where you put it. It doesn't like drip all over the place very much. And also the paste stuff is really thick. I'm going to shape two spiders now out of wire and glass, and then I'm going to solder them to my project. So I used like 16 gauge wire, because I had a lot of 16 gauge this time, so that's what I'm using a lot of. So I used 16 gauge wire, and I wired and formed and twisted and everything, and made these shapes of spiders, and I'm going to put them on it. Now I needed to make sure that's completely tinned. As I said, I have to have it completely covered in solder in order for it to end up being black. And the gaps in the little feet and in the legs, I wanted to fill those all with solder. So I had to drip solder wherever I had little gaps. Now, if you have a gap between two wires, in anything that you're doing, and you're having problems filling that gap with a little piece of solder, let it cool down a little bit and then come back to it. Because yeah, if your wire is really hot, the solders just kind of drip right through, and then you won't do what you wanted to do. But if you want to fill a gap, you're going to have to, right there I just squeezed two pieces together more. That was one way to do it. Or let it cool down and kind of drip some solder onto it. If you don't heat it up that much, it'll end up kind of bridging the gap. Now this is a piece that I made for the body of my spider, and those two things that are sticking out are kind of those little antenna things that stick out of the sides of the head. So I attached them that way, and now I'm soldering this on the bottom of it, because that's the way it fit nicely. And then I added some more solder to the top after I bent it and made sure it was in the proper place and where I wanted this little guy to be. So that's the body of my spider. And then the head is a stone, a glass stone that's a little bit smaller. I'm using that one for the head. Now, I have a whole bunch of different glass globs of various sizes and shapes, and I could find one that just fit just right for my project. So I didn't have to just resort to one. I had a bunch, and I just picked out ones that fit my wires the best. I'm adding solder all the way around it to make it secure. Now this one is my smaller spider that I made, and I decided for that one I'm using a light blue glass. And now I'm going to put my big spider on and kind of hold it in place where I want to. I'm going to use little clips again to hold it in place. So that's kind of fun. I'm going to put some solder on it, some flux on it, and then I'm just going to tack it in place. Now obviously when I'm tacking this in place, I want to make sure I don't heat up those little cobwebs too much, because yeah, they'll start falling off again, and I don't want them to fall off. So the cobwebs that are those little pieces, I got to be really careful not heat those up that much. The ones that the long pieces of cobweb lines, that's okay because they're a lot longer and they're not going to come apart by just heating them up too much. Now, as you notice, I use brand new solder at times, and I also use little globs that are sitting on my table or old pieces. So don't throw away. Besides, it's really bad for the environment to throw away lead anyway. But you can use your solder, you know, your old drops of solder. You can reuse them until they're actually attached to your project. So just keep them all. You keep them in a little container if you need to. I even have a video of how I made a silicone mold so I could melt them all into a kind of a coil so I could use them again as a stick. So sometimes I do that. So I'm just trying to get that little foot soldered on nicely. And even though these wires are tinned, they do bend a lot. Now, as I said before, you could use tinned wire, pre-tinned wire, and that would make it so you wouldn't have to worry about them being perfectly tinned, and they would still take the patina. The thing with that is I would still want to add solder a lot to them because I wouldn't want that perfect, for this project, I wouldn't want that perfect smooth look of perfect wire. I want the globby look that you get when you add solder to a wire. So it's not a consistently smooth line. So that's one of the spiders is nicely soldered on, and now I decide I'm going to put the other guy right about here, and I'm going to solder him on. Originally I was going to use some small spiders that I got that are kind of like you'd use for jewelry or something that you can order online, but they were just too small for this project. So I'm like, okay, I can make my own spiders. And that was kind of fun anyway, and it kind of looked more like the rest of the project, having them made out of the same method and materials that I used for the rest of the project. And as usual, you need to hold them in place, and you're going to have to give it a little pause after you solder something on because it'll take a little, like maybe a second or two for the solder to cool enough so that you can release the object, unless there's no pressure at all on it. But for something like this, I'm actually adding a little bit of pressure sometimes. And now I'm going to widen the original pumpkin lines with wire and foil. Well, when looking at my my project, it looked like the actual original frame that I bought, those ribs, I guess you could call them ribs, of the pumpkin itself, they just weren't thick enough. They were too thin, and they competed with, they kind of were the same thickness kind of as the spider web, and I just needed a thicker line so that they stood out more. So what I did was I added another wire along the side of each rib, and this was just it wasn't even a copper wire, it was just a wire that I had. And I'm covering these wires up with foil so that I can put solder on them. This was a little time consuming. I kind of wish I had figured this out earlier, that this would have been a nice idea to have these wider, because then I wouldn't have, for one thing, I wouldn't have foiled the original wires. I would have wrapped them first before I did that work. But that's okay. So I decided that it needed to be thicker. So I'm adding some copper tape to hold my new rib on, and then I'm adding a piece of foil on top of this just to keep it smooth and somewhat symmetrical, as you can see. it's just going to end up looking like a thicker line, like someone took a thicker Sharpie and drew a fatter line on this pumpkin. So see how much wider that rib is compared to the one above it, which hasn't been done yet. And of course, I'd have to use my little burnishing tool and kind of squish them together as much as possible. Now, when I heat this up, when I solder it, it's going to want to come apart. So I'm not going to want to heat it up very much with solder, and I just got to be careful with that. Now, I could wrap them even more. I didn't wrap the back is basically what I'm saying. And so they're not like completely wrapped all the way around as well as the original was. So it's going to have more of a tendency to come apart. Now I'm going to trace and cut black glass for the mouth. Now I'm going to be using my ring saw, but if you don't have a ring saw, you could do it by hand. It's just going to be a lot more tricky. So I used a piece of paper holding that against my teeth that I had made and drew out a pattern of where I wanted the black part of the teeth to be. So that's what I have right there. Is I used a felt tip marker, kind of a silver one that ends up not disappearing a lot when I'm using my ring saw. So I like to use the silver marker. Now I'm just cutting on the line. You can figure out whether you need to cut on the line, inside the line, outside the line, whatever, depending on how thick your markers were when you originally made your pattern and when you copied it onto your glass. Now with this project, since I'm using opaque glass, I'm not as worried about the seams between this glass and the teeth. I'm not all that worried if I have to end up filling some stuff with solder, because it's going to end up being all black when I'm done. So if this was going to be a translucent or transparent glass, we'd be able to see the black lines that the foil would end up leaving, and we'd want to be really sure that those lines were consistent. Right now I had to pause where I put a towel on my glass because it's kind of dripping on me. So that was that pause for. Anyways, so I'm cutting this out, and before I foiled this, I did hold it in place and make sure it was going to fit, and adjusted it as needed. But what I'm saying is, if this was translucent or transparent glass, I would be much pickier in making darn sure that these cuts were extremely accurate. Since it's opaque, I could have just filled in between each teeth with foil if I wanted to. Basically, I just want them to be black, so you do not see this area between the teeth of my pumpkin. So I could have just filled it with foil and then just patinaed the whole thing, or put black cardboard in, or anything opaque. But you know, to keep with this project, I decided to use black glass, and that triangle right there is going to be the nose, because I decided this guy needs a nose. But here again, it's going to be black, so I have some leeway. It's not as picky as some typical stained glass would be. But boy, using a ring saw is so much fun and so easy to cut things. And as you see, you don't need to twist your product when you are sawing, because this blade, I'm using one of the oval blades, is the whole thing has saw teeth, basically diamond cutting surfaces, so that you can cut forward, backward, left, and right. And so that's really cool. You can just kind of roll it all the way around your saw blade like this, and you can get just exactly what you want. And you could use a grinder to make it perfect afterwards if you need to adjust it, or you can actually use the ring saw itself, and you can adjust the cut a little bit that way. Now, when you're using a ring saw, you don't have to grind it afterwards because of the sharpness of the glass, because the ring saw will end up making a non-sharp, it's not very sharp. So you don't have to worry about that. So that's really awesome. So as you can see, it fits the space, not perfectly, it's a little bit off here and there. But I'm going to fill the whole thing anyway, as I said, with solder. So it's going to be black. So as long as it's there to fill up the area, it'll be wonderful. So I'm now soldering it together like you'd normally do. And I'm also filling the gap. Now, like I said earlier, if you have a hole and you're trying to fill it, it might not want to fill when it's hot. See how it kind of like just came right back? So just let it sit there for a bit. Go to another area, solder another area. When you come back, if you kind of just drop solder into that hole, it'll fill up. So see, it filled up. And don't worry about that splat that fell on my glass on the pumpkin right there, because it's not going to stick to the glass. I'll be able to just clip that right off. It really easily. It'll just flick right off. So any drops or pieces of solder will come right off. So I had to clean all the writing off my teeth, my spaces between my teeth. These aren't the teeth, these are the spaces. And now I am foiling them. Now, one thing about foiling something in a shape like this, sometimes it's hard to get the inner part of the triangle, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. So if when you're doing it, you just kind of like bend the foil and just kind of push it in like that, you can get that inner angle. Now, if you were using a transparent type glass, you might want to work on that inner angle a little bit more so that it doesn't end up having a cut V that it ends up right there, you can see. You might want to add 2 pieces to it so it's, kind of more like a perfect triangle where it overlaps there. But as I said, I don't have to worry about that with this particular project. I just need it to be foiled so that it solders in place. I could not have done this with one piece of glass, even if I was clever enough to do that, because the smile is actually curved like the whole pumpkin is, so it's not flat. So I had to make the black areas in a few different pieces in order to go around the curve of the pumpkin. Now, as you can see, I have those ribs that I made a little wider that I'm going to have to put solder on them also, because they are completely not soldered right now at this point. And you can see from here that I did my teeth in a little bit different colors of ambers. So I have some clear teeth, some light yellow, some orangish, and some yellowish. So there's kind of a variety, because I figured his teeth are not all perfectly white or anything. So I'm adding more solder to this. And remember, I'm not worried that the silver foil part is perfectly, the width of the foil compared to the triangle teeth is not consistent. That's okay, because I'm going to patina it, so it'll look fine when it's done. Now I'm going to form triangles for the eye outlines, and then I'm going to solder and foil. What I mean by eye outlines is my eyes are like way too small. So what I did was I made 4 different triangles, and so they would end up being 2 pairs of triangles, and then foiled them so they ended up having a wider line. So it was not quite as wide as the ribs of the of my pumpkin, but definitely not just the thickness of one piece of solder. So I used 2 different pieces of solder and wire, and then foiled them so that they ended up making a wider triangle look. And I'm using this to kind of take up space and make my eyeballs not look so beady-eyed. And you can see I attached the nose to one of the cobweb wires that was there. So that was kind of handy that I had a wire right there ready to attach the nose to. So I'm adding, I already pre-tinned the triangles, as you can see, so I didn't have to worry about them once I attached them to my pumpkin. So now I am just attaching them to the pumpkin. That purple stick that I have in my left hand right there is a silicone stick that one would normally use to mix resins. I think that's what they usually sell it for, but it's extremely handy in stained glass work because it won't heat up, so your hand's not going to get all hot from holding this thing, and solder won't stick to it, and it won't deteriorate with the temperature of the solder. So it's just an ideal tool to use to push here and there when you need to have something. Now I'm also, as you can see, I'm covering up all those new ribs that I made. I put a little bit of flux there at the end of the smile of the mouth, and I'm using that to help hold part of the triangle in place. But as you can see, that particular eyeball is still like floating in the air. So it's really good that I made extra support behind it in order to hold it in place, because it really needed that. And I'm using some solder now to try to tuck in back of this rib so that that triangle for the eyeball is attached nicely. And I will also add solder wherever I see that I have bare wire. I'll have to go around the whole thing and do that. When I'm done with that, I'm going to treat the whole unit with black patina, and then I'm going to add the LED lights. Now I like to use a spray bottle with my black patina, and of course I use gloves. I do this outside. I do not want to breathe it or touch this stuff. It's really bad. It's an unhealthy chemical. But anyways, I am spraying this on my happy pumpkin, and it's getting blacker and blacker as I spray this on. And then I'm going to use a toothbrush, and I'm going to touch the areas that I have not covered with black patina. So I'm going to go over it and make sure that everything is black. Now you can also notice that I did add some brownish colored glass for the stem of the pumpkin. And here it is before I added the lights. So I have this happy, odd looking Halloween pumpkin, and I wanted to add some LED lights. This is looking at it like at an angle, so you can see that it is curved. The front of it is curved and the back is flat, and I filled the cavity with LED lights. Thank you for watching, and have a happy Halloween, and have fun creating. Bye-bye.